Hi there. Welcome to the final installment of the autumn series of the On Philosophy digital dialogues organised by the Philosopher, UK-based public philosophy magazine. In fact, we do have an issue that was published earlier this year on animals, just to give you an idea of what the journal looks like. And in fact, we posted a couple of the articles that were written for that issue online today. So I'll post some links to those in the chat function when the event begins. So as it's the last event and we've had 25 events and they've been going since the beginning of September, I thought I'd use this opportunity to thank people, especially Joanna Seaphone, who has handled all of the web-based side of it and social media, which was incredibly important. Thank you to all the people that have taken part from all over the world, really. That's been one of the brilliant things about the digital format, is that as for example with today we've got Syl Ko, who's based in Maine, we've got Darren and Adam, who's based in London. So it's wonderful to bring people into conversation for these events. So in terms of kind of statistics, it's been very successful. We've had people from 63 countries tuning in over the course of the thing. And I thought I'd just thank some of the people who've tuned in regularly. So there's Wayne from Canada, Misbah from Egypt, Holger from Germany, Rafael from Saudi Arabia, Tonya, Peter, Carla, Michael, Sally, Renee, Edwin, and Andrew from the UK, and Hugo and Jesse from the United States. When I crunched the Zoom data earlier, those were the kind of main, the top people who'd signed in for events. So thanks to everyone who's done it. And just to let you know that we'll be back in the spring with another series. It's currently, early days in terms of booking names. We've got people like Robert Pippin, Manon Garcia, Deepesh Chakrabarti, Raymond Tallis, Todd May, various people. So, I mean, hopefully come autumn this time next year, we can get back to face-to-face events. But for now, the digital format is a really fantastic and exciting substitute. And I really appreciate everyone who's tuned in. To bring it to today, I would definitely like to give a big thank you to Darren Chetty and Adam Ferner. They're the hosts of the Do You Even Vegan podcast, which is a really super and slightly irreverent, not very serious podcast, considering it's on the topic of veganism. And they've hosted 2 events already today, which some of you may have already tuned into, and they've been absolutely superb as questioners and interlocutors. And I'm sure this final event of the day will be no exception. So just to introduce Syl Ko, who is going to be in conversation with Darren and Adam for this event. Syl is an independent researcher based in the United States. Her work currently focuses on the intersection of decolonial thinking and animal ethics, although in the chat just before this event, I think there's going to be a bit of philosophy of technology appearing on the horizon somewhere in the future. She's the co-author with her sister Afko of the influential 2017 collection Afroism, Essays on Pop Culture, Feminism and Black Veganism from Two Sisters. She's currently writing a book provisionally titled Human Beings and Being Human, which is the title of today's event. So I think that's probably a good point at which to hand over to Syl, Darren and Adam, and we can find out a bit more about Syl's project. So thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you, Anthony, for that warm introduction. I think for most philosophers to say it's not very serious is possibly the worst insult you can throw at them, followed by that's not really philosophy, is it? But I'm going to take it as the compliment that it was clearly intended as. The Do You Even Vegan podcast is a podcast that explores veganism, we hope personally, politically and playfully. We are interested in looking at issues and debates within veganism, so very aware that how vegans are often sort of presented as a homogenous group in the media, but we're also interested in thinking about how veganism relates to other social justice movements, if indeed we understand veganism as a I'm struggling with words, social justice movement. And I think that's why we're so excited to have Syl here today to talk about her contribution to aphorism and her work more generally. I'm going to hand over to Adam, who's going to try and offer a rough summary of the book. We'll then see whether Syl is satisfied with that summary or feels that it requires some kind of correction.
Yes, yeah, and so apologies in advance, Syl. And I think, yeah, so the idea is just to kind of give audience members who aren't familiar with your work a kind of a jumping off point so that they can kind of get to grips, and hopefully in the questions afterwards we'll be able to finesse the view, because it's a wonderful book, and it's so complex without being complicated, and capacious in its kind of purview as well, which is really wonderful. So it's a collection of essays, Aphorism, great title, wonderful, which is co-produced with AFCO, and it covers a broad range of topics, but obviously there are these common threads running throughout, even as your thoughts change and develop. And I think that's one of the things that I found really exciting, is that your position does kind of fluctuate while you're writing. So one of the threads is the conceptual connection between treatment of animals and white supremacy, and you bring a much needed decolonial lens to bear on the contemporary discussions of animal rights. Obviously, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get into everything in the depth that it deserves now, but one place I thought we could start is your interest in the distinction between humans and animals. So in your essay, "By human, everybody just means white," you make the point that the human-animal distinction is constructed along racial lines. It emerges out of a racist hierarchy created by white supremacist patriarchal society that positions white European men at the top, figuring people of color further down, and non-human animals at the base. As such, when the distinction is invoked in, for instance, civil rights settings, in claims like "I'm not an animal," a colonial invention is inadvertently reasserted. So this is a quote from the book: "When we attempt to humanize ourselves and when we glamorize the human, we uphold the superiority of whiteness." This leads you to the view expressed in the essay, "Addressing racism requires addressing the situation of animals." So against this backdrop, veganism might be seen as being born out of a critique of neoliberal humanistic white supremacy. So yeah, that's a potted view of my appreciation of your book. So yeah, and I think Darren, you've got a kind of a first question as well.
Well, yes, to kick us off, it's kind of a why did you write the book type question, but it seems that you're writing about the welfare of animals, but you're also engaged in a critique of what we talk about as the vegan movement, which is something that Adam and I are very interested in. Could you tell us why both of these things were important for you to address in the book?
Yeah, sure. I think the two always go hand in hand. If you're going to be performing an inquiry or an analysis of something, especially if it's ethical, right? Because you're probably not the first person to have thought of those questions. Humans tend to ask the same ethical questions over and over again, just in new forms. Every time you perform an inquiry or you're performing an analysis, you are somehow addressing or in conversation with the tradition of other people who've asked those questions. Maybe you don't make it explicit. In our case, we did make it explicit because of the format that we were writing in. So for people who aren't aware, aphorism is actually just a collection of blog posts. So that explains the brevity of the chapters, and also why we can't really go into a lot of depth, and we can't really go into all the cool moves that one could make. My sister wrote a book last year, or she published a book last year, which goes more into depth in the way that she sees things. I've been working on a book about how I see things. So yeah, and I want to just say this up front. I want to use a clarification that the philosopher Lewis Gordon makes between a criticism and a critique, because unfortunately it's been brought to my attention that a lot of people want to use aphorism as a way to discourage people from reading works in the canon, which was never my intention. So Lewis Gordon, he draws a distinction between a criticism, which is a sort of negative assessment or a wholesale rejection or dismissal of points of views, as if to say, you know, this is crap and the way I'm thinking about things is the right way to think about things, versus a critique, which I think he uses the language, a loving engagement with material. And I can't speak for AF here, and nothing I say, you know, I'm saying on behalf of AF, this is just for myself. My contributions to Afroism and the work that I've been doing since, I consider a loving engagement with the vegan movement, which I see myself as a part of, and which I believe people should read. Anything, you know, anything on the side of animals, I think people should read. So I just want to make that clear. And so the critique or the loving engagement that I was involved in is around the issue with the human-animal binary, generally speaking. I became concerned after reading a lot of animal ethics and just animal advocacy literature in general. I became concerned that it seemed like in mainstream vegan thinking, people wanted to preserve the human-animal binary, but shift the weight. And I was very concerned about that because I've never heard of any movement that's aware that a binary is the cause of the negative treatment, wanting to preserve the cause. So for instance, the way that we think of, let's say, the human-animal binary is that the human, right, the concept or the idea of the human is arbitrarily weighted, so it's more morally weighty, and as a result, the animal has no weight, right, or less weight. And so what animal advocates want to do in the mainstream is they want to, as Peter Singer says in one paper, desanctify the human so that we can elevate the animal. So shift the weight like this, right? Like, ugh. And for me, I became concerned. I'm like, wait, this is still happening. That means that human and animal are still in a binary type oppositional relationship. You're just shifting the weight. And it seems like if we want to liberate animals, which we want to do physically, of course, and we want to liberate them from the system, we also want to liberate these ideas from a binary kind of system. And so this is where my critique, really comes from. It's looking at what's going on in the vegan movement and saying this is it's beautiful what the project is, but the way that we're going about doing it is actually keeping in place this very problematic binary. There were some other vegans who came along. My sister, she was, I think, part of the inception of intersectional veganism, and I think they thought they were doing something really radical. And I saw the same thing happening. I saw that they were still using this binary thinking, and I think actually explaining or describing the situation of animals as speciesism is part of keeping this human-animal binary in place. And I saw that that was still happening even in their conversation, and even worse, for me, I didn't see an ethical argument as to why it's wrong to treat animals a certain way. I saw it as more of an instrumental kind of argument, namely you can use it as a way to harm other humans. And so I became very disturbed, when even radical or so-called radical vegans were, critiquing the movement. And so this is where my critique was born.
So I just want to follow up, and it's not a challenge. It's about me trying to clarify here. Is there any sort of extent to which a distinction between human animals and non-human animals is useful, worth preserving, or worth having, in your view?
Yes.
Can you give us say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Listen, there's lots of different species, right? So there's a whole bunch of animals, a whole bunch of different species. And there's one way that you can think about it, right? You can think about it in this external way, that human is just another animal, which is true, right? On a scientific level, we're just another animal. And so we can make these assessments about being human from an external point of view, right? We can do some empirical research, and we can point to all the properties and attributes and features of humans, and do that about bats and about elephants and dogs and cats. And it's true. There's nothing that you can say about being human that is different on a moral level from any other animal, right? Any one thing you can find some other animal has, right? And that's sort of the argument a lot of utilitarians make. They're like, what is it about being human that's so special in this moral sense? But what no one ever mentions is that there's something different now going on when we're the ones performing this inquiry. We have this external perspective of what it is to be human, but because we're human, we also have an internal perspective. This is the departure point for Black veganism. It's taking the internal perspective of being human and forming an animal ethic from that. Now, that's not to say that animals other animals don't have subjective lives. That's not the point. The point is that we have to remain silent about them because we are not them. Now, let's say bats were stupid enough to do philosophy, okay? And now I'm a bat. It's a different world. I'm a bat now. I'm going to say, listen, there's this external way I can think about being a bat, which is, a bat is lined up with any other animal and I can make all these empirical, assessments about it. But there's this other way about being a bat that no other animal I can say about, and that is this internal perspective. And so if I was a bat, I was going to say, and in that regard, I'm talking about being a bat, and that I can't talk that way about humans or elephants or blah, blah, blah. And now again, if we're in a third, different universe and I'm an elephant, now the elephant is going to say, I have two different perspectives on this one species by virtue of being a member of it that I don't have on other species. So I just mean in that sense that, of course, that's an important distinction. That's why people are, that's why it's weird if you say, I don't want to have sex with this kind of person, Chinese person, where people say, well, that's weird. Why does it matter? Versus no one's going to think it's weird if you don't want to have sex with a cat, right? Right there, you see, there's a really important human-animal distinction. And so I think that we have to be careful here that a human-animal distinction is not the same thing as a human-animal binary. In the same way that, for instance, if you look at gender differences, right? So there are men and there are women and there are others. But let's just, let's go back in time when it was only men and women. Well, saying that there's a man and a woman, or that they're men and women, in and of itself, that's not a problem. The problem is when you put them in this oppositional binary relationship, such that if you're making claims about one, you thereby are also making claims about the other. I don't think anyone wants to say we have to get rid of this idea that there are genders. We just want to get rid of the idea that they stand in relation in a certain way. And I think that there's something similar with the human and the animal as well. Anyone who wants to say that we have to completely get rid of any distinction between human and animal, this is an absolute pretense. It's not going to work.
Okay. No, it's great that you've mentioned that. Can I just ask one more before I'll give way to Adam? I don't want to hog this. So you talk in the book a lot about the way that people of color, Black people in particular, have been animalized, the way that in a sort of natural science order of humans with non-human animals below, we've also got this substructure of racism from sort of Linnaeus and even before. But what interested me, and I guess surprised me at first, but I think I'm making sense of it. It's, you have to be patient with me sometimes. Is I think as Adam mentioned in the introduction, what you don't do is the move that some people make, which I guess is the am I not a man? Ain't I a woman? Of wanting very clearly for Black people to be incorporated into the position of human, as of course they should, and I've been around sort of anti-racist groups where there's often been a real sense of we need to be very clear that we're not dehumanized and animalized. You're doing something that's slightly different, and I'd like you to take a few minutes to explain what that is, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of confusion in Afroism. And again, in the reader's defense, I did try to write 30 pages of a blog post, and Af, she was the one who's in charge of the blog. She was like, are you kidding me? She was like, come on. So so I had to sacrifice some details there. Right. So I'm not advocating that, for instance, people of color or other marginalized groups, I'm not suggesting that you pretend you're not human. I was trying to draw attention to, pay attention, what do you mean when you say I'm human? What are you talking about? There's a difference between a concept, the concept human, and then a particular conception of human. There's a problematic conception of human, I call it capital H, that's in operation, and that this is what we would call the one that's tangled up in all of the isms. Sylvia Winters, who's a cultural theorist and historian, she talks about this, where and a lot of the people who follow her work are also trying to make this point about what post-humanism means. Are we trying to move past the idea that we're human beings, or are we trying to move past a problematic conception of human? And that's the side that I'm on, that there's a particular conception of human in which you find this binary, but that all conceptions of human need not be that. So, and I talk about this because, and especially in the context with animals, because there's this problem in which animal advocates want to use these isms that are dehumanizing people as a model to explain and describe animal oppression. And this for me is completely wild. I understand why they're trying to do it. It just doesn't work. So if you look at any human oppression, and if you understand why they're wrong, now this can be, racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. I want to include also outgrouping because of political affiliation, because in the United States, there are people literally stabbing each other on the street because of who they voted for, and they are using this kind of language. You're a subhuman because you voted for whoever, right? This is happening. They're using that language. Whenever you have this kind of human injustice going on to the point where you have really egregious treatment of these people, what's happening is that you are excluding a particular human community or a particular human from the idea of human. That's where the negative charge comes from. It's not as simple as you're making a morally arbitrary trait or feature or property morally relevant. That's not where the badness of racism comes from. The badness of racism comes from you are using race as a reason to exclude a group of people from the idea of humanity, which means you must understand that there's something morally laden about the idea of human, or else again, you can't explain the badness of any human oppression. Now, if you move over to the way that mainstream animal advocates are talking about animal oppression, and they want to use racism and sexism and other human oppressions as a model, you have a big problem. If the negative charge of human oppression comes from excluding humans from the idea of human, and you want to say now that the idea of human is an arbitrary idea, you've now lost the grounds for explaining what makes those things wrong. And on top of it, if you don't want to do that, if you want to say, okay, yeah, that's true, excluding people from the idea of human is wrong, and so there's something going on there with that idea of human. On top of that, animal oppression isn't removing animals from or excluding animals from the idea of human. There's something different going on. And so I think animal advocates are actually undermining the extent to how bad animal oppression is by trying to force it into the same category as human oppression, that we should acknowledge there's something very different about humans oppressing one another or performing injustices against one another from animals. And that's a good thing. We should keep that divide because there are two different mechanisms going on. Now, there's a way that you can talk about them all together, and that's what Afroism was really all about. How do we talk about these two very different phenomena, these human oppressions, which, by the way, even those singular ones are different. Sexism is not like racism, and racism is not like homophobia, and homophobia is not like Islamophobia, blah, blah, blah. But what they all have in common is that this is a mechanism in which you exclude humans from the idea of human, which is why people are right to say, I don't feel human, or other people will call them animals. They're right to feel that way. It's not a coincidence that we go straight to that language, because that is happening. And there's something different happening with animals. And so our work was trying to explain, how can we talk about all these things all together in a way that doesn't compromise the difference between the kinds of oppressions that are happening?
So I hope this isn't kind of covering the same question, but in a different way, and that it's kind of more generative than that. But I suppose I kind of wanted to encourage you to say a little bit more about the malleability and fluidity of the distinction. So one thing that I'm thinking is that occasionally there are instances where the human-animal binary is twisted by oppressive groups in order to legislate certain types of behavior. And I'm thinking perhaps of like predatory sexual behavior, where in order to present defenses of abuses, men will talk about their animal nature. So I was, and that clearly is a reversal of that human-animal distinction. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I want to make clear, and I hope I did this in Afroism. I certainly do it in a lot of my talks in which I'm talking about the work for my new book. What we're doing is not trying to provide an exhaustive taxonomy about how we use human animal. There are just too many ways. I'm specifically focusing on two types of human animal distinctions that we make because they're relevant to the conversation about animal ethics. At the heart of this, and always what's in the foreground, is the treatment of animals. How do we liberate animals from an oppressive system? How do we make people or get people to think about animals in a way that gives them the dignity they deserve? And so because that's always my focus, I'm focused only on those distinctions that I think are going to be relevant to a particular debate in animal ethics that I'm contributing to. So I'm focused on the human-animal distinction understood in this more biological sense that kind of mainstream people will use, namely, humans are members of the kingdom Animalia. And so when we're saying human, we're really saying human animal. And that's where you get, we are all animals, that kind of talk happens. Then there's this response to that kind of thinking. For instance, Cora Diamond, Bernard Williams, Doug McLean, where they're going to argue, there's a sort of ontological distinction. There's the experience of being human, which is different from, just saying being a human animal. And I'm talking about a third kind of distinction. So if the first one is talking about human beings, we are all animals, and the second one is being human, we're not animals or humans. I'm doing a third one, which is the feeling human and seeing people as human, which is some humans are animals. These are the only three human animal kind of conceptions that I'm interested in my work. And so you're right that we use them, we use them in all kinds of different ways, but because it's not lending to my argument about an animal ethic, because remember, I'm trying to come up with an animal ethic that's not going to be rooted in anything about actual animals. That's what's revolutionary about our view, right? Because a lot of times people want to look at scientific data and say, oh, look, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no, we don't. That's not how we're going to get a good animal ethic off the ground. And also, especially science can change and it's not going to affect my view that we're trying to ground our animal ethic in something else. And that is on pushing against this idea that there's a race narrative.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah. Darren, did you want to follow up? Or I have plenty of questions, but I don't want to.
Go on, you take another one, Adam.
Well, I suppose it was just to kind of ask you to build on something that you the association that you mentioned already between this kind of the focus on the interiority and Black veganism, and I was just hoping that you could elaborate a little bit more about specifically that term Black veganism and what you see falling under it. Right.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel I made a mistake calling it Black veganism because people think it means it's Black people who are vegan, which is really racist. I mean, there's lots of, I find it hard to believe that all Black people are vegans for the same reason, right? Just like, people are vegans for different reasons. And so people are always like, oh yeah, and Breeze Harper and stuff. And I'm like, what? Yeah, she's Black. I mean, she's not doing Black veganism. I don't think she is, And so the point of calling it Black veganism was to merge together two ideas that seemed on the face of it like, huh? Right, so veganism, which we associate, of course, with animals, and then Black, which Blackness we associate with race. And so I was trying to bring together this idea of anti-racism with the project of animals, and hoping that people feel jarred when they see the title or hear the title, and that they would, be drawn to it. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, yeah.
And so there is a formal name. I call it subspecies internalism or subspecies subjectivism. In popular culture, we just call it Black veganism, because my view is probably more interesting to people who are familiar with the philosophical debate between people like Peter Singer and then like Cora Diamond or Bernard Williams. That's pretty much the foundation of my view. I'm agreeing with people like Cora Diamond or Bernard Williams, but saying you're missing something here. Like you're not gonna get the argument off the ground without a consideration of race. And so my argument is really building on it. So I call Peter Singer type views like species externalism or species objectivism. I call this response, like by Cora Diamond or Bernard Williams, species internalism or species subjectivism, namely understanding what it means to be human from the subjective perspective. And then I call mine subspecies, because I'm going into human beings are the only people involved, and we're using a lot of human animal language. And so what does that mean? And trying to derive an ethic from there. Again, so yeah, I would need like a whole hour to really get into the mechanism of Black veganism in a way that would include non-philosophers.
Great, that was really helpful.
Let me ask a question that's very much sort of ground level. I guess Adam and I have been very interested throughout the podcast in inviting vegans of color onto the podcast. Very aware of the sort of the Instagram version of veganism and how it's tied up with the sort of certain aesthetic and notions of well-being, etc. At the same time, one of the things that I've encountered often is this is this idea that in certain communities that food has certain cultural affinities, value, and that in communities that have been historically marginalized in some ways, there's often this attempt in some anti-racist circles even to build anti-racist practices out of a Black culture or an Asian culture, so that right-wing Asians will sometimes be criticized and accused for not being able to cook their dal correctly or eat it correctly, and so forth. So one of the things I suspect is sometimes missing in veganism is an understanding of how food has a certain cultural value within certain communities, which runs the risk of essentializing to say that. And yet I am vegan and hold that, we all should be. But I wonder whether there are any thoughts you have on how to manage that sort of ground reality when sometimes it feels like we're trying to fit an ideal notion of why we should be vegan onto a situation where people aren't going to be receptive to the kind of arguments we're producing.
Mm-hmm. I'm such a bad person to ask this question to, because I'm a person who did have very strong culinary traditions that were rooted, let's say, in dairy and eggs. I didn't know what veganism was, so I was vegetarian for a long time. And then as soon as I heard what veganism was, I thought, that's me. The next day, I threw everything out, and I think I even made a whole bunch of cookies for a party or something, and I was like, oh, that's gone. And I was a vegan the next day. For me, there was never this question about like, oh, what am I going to do about this dish that I love? I just thought, well, I'm going to find a substitute for some of the ingredients, and if not, I'm not eating the dish anymore. And so for me, it wasn't that big of an issue, and as a result, I don't think about those things. So this is my short way of saying I don't know how to answer the question, because I don't relate to the experience of being so wedded to a particular ingredient or a particular food that that would overshadow my ethical commitment.
Okay, and perhaps I'm certainly not trying to position you as the expert on it. Do you think that the account I gave, is that something that rings true in your experience?
Yes. And I have some friends who refuse to go vegan for that reason. And I have some friends who became vegan because, they found a way to substitute a particular ingredient. Like that was all it took, was that, okay, now I have a way to make this dish that's so central to my family. I don't judge them for it, right? So when we talk about it, I'm not, performing an evaluation of it, but it's something I personally just cannot relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result, it's something I don't know how to think about, though I can understand it because there's so many people close to me struggle with that issue. But yeah, I don't get it.
And perhaps more generally, to what extent do you think coming up with the clearest arguments for veganism will impact on how the world becomes vegan? Let me just give you a bit of context. Adam and I are big fans of Simon Amstell's documentary Carnage, which I don't know if you've seen it. It's a sort of
documentary, yeah.
A vegan sci-fi. It's got elements of real footage mixed with dramatizations, and it can be read as a sort of blueprint for how the world embraces veganism. And he says some things that you wouldn't tend to see in vegan discourse, like there seem to be there's a couple of very attractive men who become like celebrity chefs. And the very fact that they have this sex appeal seems to motivate a lot of people. And of course, that sounds like a very, not the sort of argument a philosopher would be making, but it does seem to be someone who's very media savvy, understanding how social movements often sort of gain momentum.
Right.
So I guess I'm asking, what is the role of the philosopher in the vegan movement? Are they just doing some sort of background work? Are they actually affecting folks on the ground, and should they be?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so I don't think there's one way, or I don't, I never propose that there's one way to argue or one way to engage in people to make them think about animals, because people think differently. And that's one of the beautiful things about, encountering many different beings, not just humans, right? And even I have different cats and they all have their own kind of thing going on. So some people, for instance, I have a really good friend. She's an extremely logical person, and she does like philosophy of math and stuff. She was vegetarian for a long time. Every single day ate the same cheese sandwich regimen. And then, I told her one time I was talking about veganism, not even in an argument sense, but just like, oh, here's some things that people say about why you should be vegan. And literally on the spot, she was like, oh, that makes sense. I'm vegan now. Okay, that actually happened. Okay, because that's the kind of person she was. I know another person, they stopped eating meat because they watched Bambi. Right, so they were moved by this cute little narrative. Someone else who went vegan for because someone they really admire became vegan, and they said, well, I want to be like that person, which I don't think we should laugh at. I mean, this in ancient Chinese philosophy, they talk about the moral exemplar views, and this is a completely legitimate way of being ethical, that there's someone that you admire and you say, I don't know the reasons for why I should be vegan or why I should do this or this, but this person that I admire who's virtuous does it, and for that reason I'm going to now become vegan. So I don't ever push one away. And I actually don't even try to convince people. I moved away from that. I used to be this kind of militant vegan who's like yelling at people's faces at Chipotle. And then I had this experience that kind of jolted me out of that. And I changed my focus from trying to change people's minds to trying to understand, what do I have to do to always allow myself to have my mind changed. And so I saw, my contributions to Black veganism and my work now as not so much me trying to convince people of anything, but sharing my story of the things I was thinking about and the kind of experiences I had that brought me to thinking about animals much differently, in terms of how I first became vegan, but also how I shifted from being this kind of more conventional vegan to being a vegan who completely, as you can see, I moved away from even thinking about it as speciesism to something that's very much connected to this larger narrative about race. And so this was more about me allowing myself to become mentally adventurous and kind of, surf on the thoughts of other people and open myself to listening to other people to allow myself to change, as opposed to trying to give some kind of argument or whatever.
So I guess kind of following on from that, but also I'm slightly aware of time. I want to make sure that we've got ample time for questions from the floor. So I guess this is not entirely sure how best to frame this, so apologies in advance. But I guess the thought is that one might worry that some people become vegan for the wrong reasons, that ultimately reinscribe the kind of oppressive hierarchies. So I don't necessarily think that this is the wrong reason, but I do see that we were talking to Gary Francione earlier, and he puts a premium on personhood, and he makes this distinction between things and persons. And to my mind, his view of personhood is very deeply tied to a neoliberal Eurocentric model of the self, and that's something that I know that you have taken issue with. And so one can become vegan because of reasons that he presents, but if those reasons ultimately kind of undermine or reassert some of the problematic dynamics, do you think that that's an issue?
No, I don't. And sometimes you can even give the best argument, and then someone's going to hear another argument that's, very compelling, and they'll move the opposite way too. I mean, I try to be very careful when it comes to anything ethical, because usually most of these things are just stepping stones to the next thing or the next thing. I don't know what else to say. I don't think that there is a right reason to be vegan. Actually, I don't have a reason why I'm vegan myself. When people ask me, why are you vegan? I will literally tell you, I just don't want to be the kind of person that's not affected by this. Like, for me to, like, what it is to be a good person is that you are moved by animals suffering or people suffering or the planet dying. If you ask me why, I don't have one for you, and I don't think I need one. In the same way as if you ask me, why do I love my partner? I'm going to probably squint at you and I say, you want me to give you an argument for that? I'm going to say, I would probably begin to wonder, do you know what the word partner means, right? Because what the word partner means is to already have inscribed within it certain parameters for what kind of interactions or what kind of judgments you're going to have about something. And that's how I honestly feel about veganism, that it's something that's deeply related, tied into your soul, deeply tied into your character. And even if you do have an argument, this is just a way of articulating something, but that may not actually be the reason. I don't know if there's a reason. I think it's deeper than that. And that's why I don't really care why people are vegan. I don't really care why people are animal advocates. I am so deeply invested in this issue you that I honestly do see anybody who's a vegan and anybody who's doing anything they can on the side of animals, I consider that we're kindred spirits. We might disagree on politics, we might disagree on religious stuff, we might disagree on, you know, who's the hottest celebrity at the moment, we might disagree about what music we like. And for me, I am willing to sit there and let's hash it out, because it's worth it that we have this bigger thing. And that's actually something that I love about being in the vegan movement, that you have people from all different walks of life who care about animals. And if it wasn't for that, I would have never sat in the same room with these people as some of the people that I call my closest, dearest friends, whose reasons I disagree with, whose politics I disagree with, everything I disagree with, but we sit there and we love each other because we believe that, listen, we need to care about what's happening with animals and we need to do something about this.
Oh, Adam's pausing, so I'll jump in. Listening to you say that, it sounds like it's a personal thing, and I could. I mean, I think the comparison with why are you with your partner, etc. That makes sense to me. I guess a lot of vegans, and I think Gary certainly at lunchtime, there was this idea that part of being a vegan is to recruit. Yeah, it's not just a matter of personal conduct, but a matter of persuading others. I wonder if that's the case for you, or whether you see that differently.
I don't think to be a vegan means that you have to be a recruiter, no. I think you, in a way, naturally are a recruiter. I don't think it's an intention, right? Sometimes it's a part of my life. So sometimes I'll just mention it, like, oh yeah, I'm vegan, I can't have this. And a person will say, oh, why are you vegan? And then you start talking, right? You talk about your journey there, or you talk about whatever. And then they're like, oh, okay. Maybe they might think more about it too. I don't know. Maybe they don't. I don't know. I don't see my role as that I have to recruit. Gary and I might disagree. I love Gary. I mean, he was really influential in my becoming vegan, actually. But yeah, I don't agree with that at all.
Great, fantastic. So I'm going to just read out a couple of the questions that we've got. One of them from Pablo Perez Castello, who asked, that has been attending all of these events, is for greater kind of like clarification on this notion that speciesism maintains and reproduces the human-animal binary, and why does targeting speciesism as the problem conceal anthropocentrism?
So again, if you look at where species is coming from, and Peter Singer's pretty clear about this, he chooses to adopt the word because he says it calls to mind other things that people already know are, unjust, like racism and sexism. We might disagree what racism or sexism look like or what it is, but most people in their right mind are going to say, yeah, racism is bad, right? And then where the real fighting starts is, what is racism, right? And so I understand his motive for using that. Now, the issue, though, is that he is assuming that when we talk about being human, right, or which he calls species membership, I think there's something deeper going on when we talk about being human, which, again, I don't think you can understand racism or sexism unless you take that view, but let's just call it species membership. He's assuming that species membership is like a category, race or sex. So if you invoke on it, you're also invoking a sort of supremacist narrative. And so this is where I'm going to disagree. And where I see the binary being maintained is, if you are going to have to, so the reasoning there is that this is what's happening, right? The human animal binary is kind of like this. You have one weight on this side and you have not enough weight on this side. And so that the strategy is going to be to do this. And so again, this is still binary thinking. If we actually liberated animals from a human-animal binary, how you think about one would have no effect on how you think about the other. These would be completely disambiguated terms, right, morally speaking. And so again, my concern is that since the binary is the cause of what's happening to non-human animals, the binary is something that we should be looking to rid ourselves of. And by using this narrative of speciesism, we're keeping it in place. We're just shifting the weight. I understand some people might worry that because we're talking about valuing human, that this is like human supremacy. And this is why I'm always saying, I say, be careful. Yes, species membership is a group kind of membership term in the way that race or sex is a group membership term, but I don't think it has to always be a pernicious one. So there are other group membership terms that are not pernicious. One example that's obvious to all of us is family. Family is a group membership term that has huge moral implications, right? I would jump in front of a bullet for my sister. I'm not going to do it for my neighbor. But that doesn't mean that I don't have obligations to my neighbor. It just means I'm going to feel like I have a special reason to do this for my family. And I'm going to say, well, the reason is family. That's what it is to be family. So that's one example of a group membership term that includes within it moral parameters, but which we would not consider supremacy, right? So if I talk about being a member of the Ko family and that I'm doing this for my mother or I'm doing this for my sister because they're a family member, that doesn't mean I'm a supremacist when it comes to all their families, right? Whereas if I were to talk about, oh, I'm doing this for someone because they're white, or I'm doing this for someone because they're a man, I would. So we have to be careful that we can't be superficial here and think that every single group membership term must be a supremacist term. It can be used as a supremacist term in the way that some families do see themselves in this sort of supremacist way. But I'm arguing we need to be careful, because then again, we're going to lose the grounds for understanding human to human oppression. And human to human oppression is not human supremacy understood in this biological anthropological sense. It's human supremacy with a capital H, a particular conception, a particular narrative of human that's at play. And that I think is the problem when it comes to human oppression as well as animal oppression, not just the bare concept of the human.
That's really helpful, and I think probably ties in some ways to a question which has been asked by Jeremy Hess, which is about the kind of nuances and the subtleties of language, and the languages that the kind of language that we use to talk about these things. So Jeremy says, do you have suggestions for how we can apply these ideas to our outreach / language? For instance, I wonder what you think of saying our fellow humans. And I suppose just to kind of dig into that a little bit more deeply, I guess the idea is a question there is, oh, sorry.
Our fellow animals.
Our fellow animals. Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So I suppose a lot trades on the terms of reference, and I'm assuming that you're talking about these in a technical sense in the way that philosophers do in a seminar room. But are you engaged in or particularly focused on the way that specific terms live in the world outside the seminar room?
No. And actually my analysis comes from observing ordinary, ordinary, I don't mean in this, like in the negative sense. I mean people outside of a philosophy room or outside of the vegan movement, right? Like if you run into the person in the street eating a cheese sandwich, right? How they're talking or whatever. And actually regular people use, they shift context about when you're talking about human animal, they shift context right off the bat. So for instance, in one instance, you can talk about animals or say animal and you understand it in this biological sense. And then in a second later, you can understand how it's being used in a social sense. So obvious example, our president here once referred to people in the Latino community as animals. Everyone right away knew that they didn't say, oh, Donald Trump is such a great biologist, right? No one said that. Right away, people understand that context shift, even though they're not sitting there like me saying human subscript 1, human subscript 2, human, they're not doing that. So people already, I'm not trying to change anything about how people talk. I'm saying actually look at how people talk. They're actually revealing really detailed ethical information to us. And I'm actually saying to my vegan fellows here, listen, when we go out on the street and we're saying, hey, it's speciesism to be eating that egg sandwich, and they say, what are you talking about? And I always notice the same kind of response. So for instance, and this is something that actually helped me come up with the theory of Black veganism, that I was involved in an encounter. I had a militant vegan friend with me who I agreed with him on everything. He approached someone eating an egg sandwich and he said, that animal suffered and that's speciesism and blah, blah, blah. And the person was just like, what are you talking about? There's people in jail for 20 years for a minor drug offense, and my grandparents were in concentration camps. And then my friend said, so it's wrong if you put a human in a cage, but not an animal. And the person's face was like, what are you, like, these two were talking right past each other. And it was the first time I realized that when an ordinary person responds that way, they're saying, what are you talking about? Even humans aren't human. And I thought, oh, I've never even thought of it that way, because I was always so engrossed in kind of just, the more conventional vegan thinking. And this is actually what helped me start, start paying more attention to how the ordinary person responds. So instead of us being judgmental and saying, no, that's this, just, shut up for a second and listen to what they're saying, because they're giving you clues like this is how people actually think. And they're grokking something that's actually right? This person was making a point about the human understood socially and the animal understood socially, whereas my friend was talking about things in this very biological sense, which is not where a lot of the ethical action is actually happening.
Fantastic. Darren, did you have thought?
No, I was going to say there's a question here from Roger Yates. Do you accept that the values of veganism are left or left-leaning values? He says it sounds like you do not. Can you say a little bit about that? I mean, we Adam and I, just to put in context, have talked about veganism as a social justice movement, and certainly social justice has this kind of connotation with if the liberal left, if not left wing. But you don't. Can you tell us about that?
No. And one of my favorite papers actually is by Will Kimlicka, where he's actually asking what is it with the left not being into animal stuff? He says, listen, aren't the left supposed to be like for the underdog champions for, those who are experiencing all these injustices, and who experiences more injustice than animals, right? Even people always bring up like, oh, there's different kinds of animals, like companion animals, which that's bullshit. Depending on who their owner is, that can change very quickly, or what shelter they go to, right? So it's very much dependent on the mercy of whatever human companion they have. And so in this paper, he's trying to figure out, what is it with the left not caring about the animal stuff? And I actually was sort of agreeing with him, like, oh yeah, that's right. What is it with the left? And actually a lot of people that I know who are really involved in animal advocacy tend to be religious right. And actually there's some of my friends who are not vegans will actually point this out. They're like, oh, it's always people who don't give a shit about race or sex or whatever. And they're always, so I think depending on what perspective you're taking, they either think it's too much on the left or it's too much on the right. And from where I'm sitting, I've noticed that it's lots of different people are, or I think the values that align with what we call veganism are not necessarily left or not necessarily right.
Just had someone ask, can you mention the Will Kimlicka title of that paper? I read it. I can't remember.
Maybe Anthony in the background can be frantically Googling. That's the kind of, yeah.
I don't remember. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't remember the title. I always remember the author, but I don't remember any titles. I just remember that he wrote it, and it was great.
So he was saying that the vegan movement is strangely apolitical, and I think Gary was saying that earlier as well.
Yeah. He was trying to give an argument for why people who identify on the left should be invested in animal advocacy, or invested at least in interrogating animal injustice. And he was trying to give an argument, trying to show, look, our values are consistent, and here's why. And he was kind of pointing, pulling from like Bruce Harper type arguments for it. So if you're asking me like in terms of like the actual values that are involved in veganism, I don't think that they're specifically aligned with a political, a party or a political side or whatever. I don't see it that way. Though I have heard, like I said, I have heard from both sides where they will say, oh, that seems like, crazy religious people, or crazy people who are, the Aryan white supremacist people who are vegan purists and stuff. I'm like, well, we have a vast movement, I guess.
So Anthony has helpfully dropped a potential link to the potential paper in the chat for anybody who's interested. And I suppose just to push a little bit more on this kind of notion of collaboration and coalition forming. It was interesting to me and Darren that, who recently co-authored this book, How to Disagree, about the fact that you and Af collaborated on this together. And I take it that this was a very kind of like conscious decision in compiling the collection in order to perhaps again raise these questions about what it is to be a social agent, a moral agent, and somebody who isn't necessarily this kind of like discrete boundary, Eurocentrically conceived human individual. And so like collaborative projects do seem to be quite important. Mm-hmm. And so if you could say more about the actual kind of like nitty gritty of collaborative projects, that'd be great.
Yeah, so honestly, we weren't thinking that deep when we were collaborating. Af was writing about racism and sexism and stuff for other blogs. She didn't have her own blog. And I was always trying to get her to be vegan. Whenever I know a smart person, I'm like, if I just want to talk to them and see if they can get them and, like just think about the animal stuff, because I'm not a practical thinker. So I don't have practical solutions for what to do about animals. So I always hope some a smart person, they'll think about animals and be like, oh, I have something. And Af was, super smart, and she had this great audience. And I thought, why aren't you interested in animals? I was, curious. And so she, we talked for many months, and I was grilling her on Skype, and then she eventually became vegan. And then she decided to start her own blog. And then she said, I feel nervous doing this by myself. Do you have anything you can contribute? And I always have a stack like this of papers on my desk of junk I'm working out. And I said, yeah, sure. And so it actually, she would submit something, and then she's like, okay, it's your turn. And I would submit something. We actually didn't really think that deeply about the project. And actually you can even see that we start kind of fusing a little bit more as the work goes on, because in the beginning, I think she was working closely with Breeze Harper, and they were more interested in diversity in the movement. And I was more interested in, like, look at this kind of this interesting conceptual stuff that's going on between race and animality. And then we eventually, she kind of moved over to that side. So I won. and then that's how it happened. So yeah, we weren't really making a statement in working together. It was more like, she needed help, and I always have lots of junk that I'm writing and can give.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. So it was an over-reading that I'm like, oh yeah, this is all about deconstructing.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I should have gone with it to seem cool. I don't know.
Yeah. We've got the chat is very active, and I haven't been attending to it nearly as much as I should have been. But yeah,
pretty much at time, are we? Or?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of those things where Darren and I, in anticipation of this conversation, were just like chat, and we have so many questions, but it's such a short amount of time.
It is, yeah. I was trying to keep it short, so
let's try what's the question you wish we had asked you?
Oh yeah.
Well, something very boring. What is this big debate that I'm commenting on, and how do I think I'm modifying it? So it's the most boring of all questions, which honestly, I mean, if anyone is watching and they're interested, you can look on YouTube. I think there's a talk where I go into this, and everyone's always disappointed. They think I'm going to be talking about all this sexy stuff. And really, what I'm talking about is this debate, which I think is one of the most important debates actually in the world, which is why I'm really invested in it, because, it's about how we think about animals, and it's about how we think about ourselves. And I think there's a lot of things that we can sacrifice needlessly because we think we're doing something for animals. And there's an easier way to go. And it's an easier way to think about lots of different injustices in the same space without doing that kind of superficial, shallow thing of trying to make them like one another. But I'm glad you didn't ask me that question, because then that would have just been a 2-hour talk. So.
Which is accessible on YouTube, perhaps.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, perfect. Well, yeah, I mean, I think it just really remains to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And it's something that Darren and I, again, have spoken about quite a lot, is it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk to like-minded but also unlike-minded people about the same topic. And it's not, and it doesn't feel like there are that many forums to actually kind of understand how a moral position can be reached from different angles all at once. And we've had a real kind of like variety today of Eva Meyer's position to your position here. And I think that's I mean, it feels like, to me, it's quite like a hopeful note that all of these different kind of conflicting views can be embraced. And perhaps just in the final minute, it would be good to hear if you had any, do you feel hopeful about the possibility for progress in the kind of vegan movement?
Yes, I do. Especially because a lot of people in the beginning, when Af and I were writing, they were worried. They're just like, aren't you being divisive? And I thought, oh, that's such a bizarre question. I've never talked to so many people, and I've never made so many friends in such a short amount of time. I don't think it works against animals to introduce more kinds of veganism. That's really what my project is. If you look at any other kind of movement, there are lots of different entry points into it. There's lots of infighting and lots of different ways that you can conceive of what the problem is and what the solution is. And that's a good thing. When you have a really big thing, when you have a really big stone that you want to pick up and carry, you don't want everybody on one side lifting the same side, right? You're not going to move the stone. You want people on all different sides. And from a myopic perspective, we're on different sides. But in the big picture, we're all all going to be picking up the stone together because we're all positioned around it. And so that's what I see my project as doing, that, and I see people as being receptive to it, which is that there are different kinds of veganism. Black veganism is one way you can approach an animal ethic, thinking about being human from the subjective perspective. So we're going to have a completely different answer to the species question, right? And then you can also be a species externalist, like the Peter Singer type of people. I always tell people, don't stop reading Peter Singer, don't stop reading, Laurie Gruen, don't stop reading Gary Francione, don't stop reading Breeze Harper. Read everything. You don't have to agree with everything, but understand that these are all different entry points. You can get more and more people into the movement this way, and that the more kinds of veganism we have, not necessarily because people cosmetically look different. I don't think that should be the aim. I think the aim should be that we have lots of different kinds of veganism so that there's more and more entry points into this room. So I'm extremely optimistic because I see so many people who disagree with me and they still think it's a good project, that this is an important thing to introduce different kinds of veganisms.
Wonderful. I feel like that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Syl, thank you so much. I think Anthony will reappear now.
There he is.
Yeah, sorry, I thought there was a further summation there, Darren. But yeah, I'm happy to add to the thanks to Syl, to both of you. You must be quite tired by now after all of the hard work, and thank you so much for all the reading and prep you've done put into these 3 super conversations. We'll do our best to get them online as soon as possible. And I guess as this is the last event of the series, happy festive break. How's life over in Maine, Syl? Because we're all either in lockdown or tier 3, and you guys are entering tier 3 soon, Adam and Darren. So what's your Christmas break going to be looking like? Have you got access to restaurants and stuff, or are you going to be...
Yeah, stuff's open. I'll probably just be sitting home eating popcorn. I don't have a healthy diet. I'm glad no one asked me the question about what I'm making for Christmas.
I thought that was your trademark, Darren and Adam, that you ask people what they're eating. So what are you going to be eating for Christmas?
Probably popcorn.
Popcorn's quite healthy. I feel,
a lot of fiber.
I've been eating a lot of latke and donuts, fried food for Hanukkah. Just
nice.
So that's possibly even less healthy than popcorn. Yeah.
Cool. Well, anyway, I think I mean, there's a lot of grateful comments coming in from people who've attended, and gratitude reciprocated. Thank you for tuning in, and again, thank you to Darren and Adam. You've been real stars today. Like, the 3 conversations have been super, and Syl, like, incredibly, powerful. And I don't know, it's obviously a thing about vegans, just this energy. Like, I haven't heard that many people say I could do this for 6 hours, but both you and Gary, and I got the impression Eva could have, so there's a real energy which is has been very palpable today. So thank you to you all, and yeah, I think I'll just sign off now. So lovely way to end the series, and yeah, we'll be back next year. And Syl, if you ever want to write anything for the Philosopher, just get in touch. I'd love to.
Okay, will do.
Publish something by you. So bye then. Thanks for tuning
Bye.
in, and
Thanks, everyone.
happy
Thanks,
Christmas.
Syl.